The old upright piano sat in the corner of Lincoln Elementary's music room, its mahogany finish dulled by decades of eager young hands. 8-year-old Jaden Williams approached it slowly, his small fingers trembling not from nervousness, but from pure excitement. He'd been waiting for this moment all week, the school talent show auditions. Mrs. Catherine Henderson, the music teacher with 25 years of experience and a reputation for maintaining standards, watched from behind her desk. Her lips were already pressed into a thin line of disapproval as she observed Jaden's worn sneakers and hand-me-down clothes. His backpack was patched with duct tape, and his shirt, though clean, had seen better days. "Well," she said sharply, not bothering to look up from her paperwork. "Are you going to stand there all day, or are you actually going to play something? I have real students to audition after you." Jaden's heart hammered against his ribs, but he'd practiced for this moment every day after school. His grandmother had taught him to read music using old songbooks from the library, and he'd spent countless hours watching YouTube videos to perfect his technique. Today, he was going to play Chopin's Minute Waltz, the same piece his grandmother used to play before arthritis stole her ability to make music. Before we see what happens when Jaden sits down at that piano, I want you to know that this story will challenge everything you think you know about talent, prejudice, and the power of music to change hearts. If you believe that every child deserves a chance to shine regardless of their background, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly because of how they looked? Let's build a community that stands up for what's right. Now, let's see what Jaden is about to unleash on that old piano. Jaden placed his small hands on the keys and began with a simple scale to warm up. The notes rang clear and true, each one perfectly placed. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows raised mockingly as she finally looked up from her papers. "Oh, how quaint," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Let me guess, you learned that from some YouTube video? Or perhaps your family thinks they know about classical music?" The other students in the room shifted uncomfortably. There was Emma Thompson, the blonde girl whose mother was on the school board, and Tyler Davis, whose father owned half the businesses in town. They'd never heard their teachers speak to anyone like this before. Jaden's cheeks burned, but he continued playing, his small fingers moving with surprising grace and precision. He began the opening notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz, the melody flowing like water from the old piano. The instrument, despite its age, seemed to come alive under his touch. "Stop, stop, stop." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the music like a knife. She stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward, hitting the wall with a sharp bang. "This is exactly what I mean. You people always think you can just improvise your way through real music. This requires discipline, proper training, breathing even. Not some street corner approach." The room fell silent except for the sound of Jaden's sharp intake of breath. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. Tyler looked down at his shoes, uncomfortable with the tension that had suddenly filled the air. "I wasn't improvising, Mrs. Henderson," Jaden said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Chopin's Minute Waltz in D-flat major, Opus 64, number 1. My grandmother taught me the proper fingering in." "Your grandmother?" Mrs. Henderson laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Let me explain something to you, child. Classical music isn't something you pick up from relatives or internet videos. It's a sophisticated art form that requires years of proper instruction, cultural understanding, and frankly, a certain refinement that some people simply don't possess." She walked closer to the piano, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. The Minute Waltz isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about understanding Chopin's European heritage, his classical training, his aristocratic sensibilities. It's about precision, elegance, and tradition, qualities that simply can't be taught in certain environments. Jaden's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back. "My grandmother says music is universal. She says it speaks to everyone's heart, no matter where they come from." "Your grandmother," Mrs. Henderson said with a sneer, "clearly doesn't understand the difference between real music and whatever it is your community calls music. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the hip-hop club or the basketball team." those activities might be more suitable to your natural talents. Emma Thompson couldn't stay silent any longer. Mrs. Henderson, he was playing beautifully. I've been taking piano lessons for 3 years, and I can't play nearly that well. Mrs. Henderson's sharp gaze turned to Emma. Miss Thompson, you have the benefit of proper instruction from the Mitchell Conservatory. You understand musical theory, proper posture, and the cultural context of classical compositions. That's the difference between real musical education and amateur hour. Tyler Davis raised his hand tentatively. But Mrs. Henderson, he knew the name of the piece and everything. Isn't that what matters? Mr. Davis, Mrs. Henderson said coldly, any child can memorize a title. Understanding music, truly understanding it, requires more than that. It requires breeding, cultural background, and proper training. Some people are simply born into musical families with the right advantages. Others are not. The words hung in the air like poison. Jaden stood frozen at the piano bench, his small hands still resting on the keys. Every muscle in his body seemed to have turned to stone. He'd heard whispers before, seen the looks when he walked through certain neighborhoods with his mother, but never had someone in authority spoken to him so directly, so cruelly. Perhaps, Mrs. Henderson continued, warming to her theme, you should consider activities more appropriate to your background. I'm sure there are other talents you could develop that would be more natural for someone like you. Someone like me? Jaden repeated, his voice barely audible. Well, yes, Mrs. Henderson said, as if explaining something obvious to a small child. We all have our natural inclinations, don't we? Some people are meant for intellectual pursuits, classical arts, refined culture. Others are more athletic, more rhythmic in different ways. There's no shame in recognizing where your talents truly lie. The door to the music room suddenly opened, and Ms. Angela Rodriguez, the young third-grade teacher, stepped inside. She'd been walking down the hallway when she heard Mrs. Henderson's raised voice through the thin walls. What she saw made her stomach clench with disgust and anger. Mrs. Henderson, Ms. Rodriguez said carefully, is everything all right in here? I could hear raised voices. Everything is perfectly fine, Ms. Rodriguez, Mrs. Henderson replied stiffly. I was simply explaining to young Jaden here that the classical music program requires a certain level of preparation that he might not yet possess. Ms. Rodriguez looked at Jaden's tear-filled eyes, then at the uncomfortable expressions on Emma and Tyler's faces. The tension in the room was palpable, and she had a sinking feeling about what she'd walked into. Jaden, Ms. Rodriguez said gently, would you mind playing a little bit for me? I'd love to hear what you've been working on. Jaden looked up at her with grateful eyes. Ms. Rodriguez had always been kind to him, always encouraged him to pursue his interests regardless of what others might think. She was one of the few teachers who saw potential in all her students, not just the ones from certain backgrounds. I don't think that's necessary, Mrs. Henderson interjected quickly. As I was explaining, classical music requires. I'd really like to hear him play, Ms. Rodriguez said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that made Mrs. Henderson pause. Jaden, please, go ahead. With trembling fingers, Jaden began the minute waltz again. This time, despite his tears, despite the humiliation burning in his chest, the music flowed from him with even greater emotion. The pain he felt seemed to pour through his fingertips, transforming into something beautiful and haunting. The melody danced through the room, each note perfectly placed, each phrase shaped with an intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught. Ms. Rodriguez felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she listened. This wasn't just technical proficiency, this was musical genius. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed momentarily stunned by what she was hearing. For just a moment, her certainty wavered. The child's playing was extraordinary. The phrasing, the dynamics, the emotional depth, it was the kind of performance that came from deep understanding, not just mechanical practice. But prejudice has a way of reasserting itself, and Mrs. Henderson quickly pushed down her momentary doubt. As I said, she announced when Jaden finished, anyone can memorize a piece. True musical understanding requires more than just hitting the right notes. Ms. Rodriguez stared at her colleague in disbelief. She'd just witnessed one of the most beautiful performances she'd ever heard from a child, and Mrs. Henderson was still dismissing it. The level of bias required to ignore such obvious talent was staggering. "Mrs. Henderson," Ms. Rodriguez said slowly, "that was exceptional playing. Jaden clearly has remarkable talent." "Ms. Rodriguez," Mrs. Henderson replied coldly, "you teach third grade. I don't expect you to understand the nuances of classical music education. This child has some basic motor skills, I'll grant you that, but real musical ability requires proper breeding, cultural background, and extensive formal training." The word breeding hung in the air like a slap. Ms. Rodriguez felt her face flush with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. Making a scene wouldn't help Jaden, and she needed to document this interaction carefully. "I see," Ms. Rodriguez said quietly. "Well, Jaden, I thought your performance was absolutely beautiful. You should be very proud of your hard work and dedication." Jaden looked up at her with grateful eyes, but the damage had been done. Mrs. Henderson's words had cut deep, striking at every insecurity he'd ever felt about not fitting in, about being different, about not being good enough. "The auditions will be posted tomorrow," Mrs. Henderson announced dismissively. "Emma, Tyler, you may stay for your proper auditions. Jaden, I think we're finished here." The dismissal was clear and cruel. Jaden gathered his sheet music with shaking hands, his dreams of performing in the talent show crumbling around him. As he walked toward the door, Ms. Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jaden," she whispered, "don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong in music. What you just played was extraordinary. But 8-year-old hearts are fragile things, and Mrs. Henderson's poison had already begun to work." As Jaden walked down the empty hallway toward the school exit, he wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe classical music wasn't for kids like him. Maybe he should stick to what people expected from someone who looked like him. Behind him, in the music room, Ms. Rodriguez was having a very different conversation with Mrs. Henderson. "Catherine," she said, dropping the formal address, "what I just witnessed was completely unacceptable. That child has incredible talent, and you dismissed him based on nothing but prejudice." "Prejudice?" Mrs. Henderson laughed. "Angela, I've been teaching music for 25 years. I know talent when I see it, and I know the difference between real musical education and amateur enthusiasm. That child might have some natural rhythm, but classical music requires sophistication, cultural understanding, proper training." "Cultural understanding?" Ms. Rodriguez interrupted. "You mean being white?" Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "How dare you suggest that race has anything to do with my professional judgment? I'm talking about musical background, proper training, family support for classical education. All of which are code words for socioeconomic status and race," Ms. Rodriguez said bluntly. "Catherine, that little boy just played Chopin better than most high school students I've heard. His technique was flawless, his musicality was extraordinary, and you dismissed him because he doesn't fit your idea of what a classical musician should look like." "That's absolutely ridiculous," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "I judge students based solely on their musical ability and preparation. Then explain to me how a child who just played a complex Chopin waltz with perfect technique and beautiful musicality doesn't qualify for your talent show." Mrs. Henderson struggled for an answer. Deep down, in a place she didn't want to examine too closely, she knew Ms. Rodriguez was right. Jaden's performance had been exceptional by any measure. But admitting that would mean confronting beliefs she'd held for years, assumptions that were woven into the very fabric of how she saw the world. "The talent show requires students who can represent our school appropriately," she said finally. "Students who understand the cultural context of classical music, who come from families that value proper musical education. Students who are white and wealthy," Ms. Rodriguez said flatly. "Students who are prepared," Mrs. Henderson insisted. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Principal Michael Thompson entered the room, his expression serious. He'd been walking past when he heard raised voices, and the last few minutes of conversation had been audible through the thin walls. "Ladies," he said carefully, is there a problem here? Ms. Rodriguez and Mrs. Henderson looked at each other, both realizing that their heated discussion had likely been overheard. Principal Thompson was known for his fair-mindedness and his commitment to equality, but he was also diplomatic and preferred to handle sensitive situations quietly. "We were just discussing the talent show auditions," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "I see," Principal Thompson said. "And how did those go?" "Very well," Mrs. Henderson replied. Emma Thompson and Tyler Davis both showed excellent preparation. There was one student who wasn't quite ready for this level of performance. Principal Thompson nodded slowly. He'd noticed Jaden Williams walking down the hallway with tear-stained cheeks and had wondered what had happened. The boy was one of his favorite students, polite, hard-working, and incredibly talented in multiple areas. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, "what was your impression of the auditions?" Ms. Rodriguez hesitated. She wanted to tell him everything, but she also knew that making accusations without careful consideration could backfire and ultimately hurt Jaden more than help him. "I think there may have been some miscommunication about what constitutes appropriate preparation for classical music performance," she said diplomatically. Principal Thompson studied both women's faces. He'd been an educator long enough to recognize tension when he saw it, and something significant had clearly happened here. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "I'd like to review the audition criteria with you tomorrow morning. Let's make sure we're being fair and consistent in our evaluations." "Of course," Mrs. Henderson agreed, though her voice carried a hint of defensiveness. As Principal Thompson left the room, Mrs. Henderson turned back to Ms. Rodriguez. "I hope you're not planning to make trouble over this, Angela. I've been teaching music here since before you were even out of college." "I'm not planning to make trouble," Ms. Rodriguez replied quietly. "But I am planning to make sure every student gets a fair chance to show their abilities." Meanwhile, Jaden Williams sat on the city bus next to his mother, Keisha Williams, staring out the window with empty eyes. Keisha worked 2 jobs, morning shift at the hospital as a nursing assistant and evening shift cleaning offices downtown, but she always made time to pick up Jaden from his after-school activities. "How were the auditions, baby?" she asked, immediately noticing his dejected expression. "I don't think I'm going to be in the talent show," Jaden said quietly. Keisha's heart clenched. She'd been listening to Jaden practice that Chopin piece for weeks, had watched him pour his heart into every note. His grandmother, Dorothy Williams, had taught him to read music before he could even read words properly, and his natural talent was undeniable. "What happened?" Keisha asked gently. Jaden struggled to explain without repeating the hurtful words Mrs. Henderson had used. At 8 years old, he didn't fully understand the implications of what had been said to him, but he understood enough to know that he'd been found wanting, lacking something essential that would forever keep him from belonging in the world of classical music. "Mrs. Henderson said I'm not ready," he said finally. "She said I need proper training and cultural understanding." Keisha felt anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "Baby, you've been playing piano since you were 4 years old. Grandma Dorothy taught you everything she knew, and she went to music school back in the day." "But Mrs. Henderson said that's not the same as real training," Jaden replied. "She said some people are just born for classical music and others aren't." The words hit Keisha like a physical blow. She'd grown up hearing similar messages, had fought against the same prejudices her entire life. The idea that someone had just told her brilliant, talented son that he didn't belong in classical music because of who he was made her want to march back to that school and demand answers. But she also knew that making a scene could make things worse for Jaden. As a single black mother working 2 jobs, she had to be careful about how she challenged authority figures. One wrong move could result in Jaden being labeled a problem child, which could follow him throughout his school career. "Jaden," she said softly, "you are every bit as good as any other child your age. Your talent is real, your hard work is real, and your music is beautiful. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." "But what if she's right?" Jaden asked, his voice small and uncertain. "What if I'm just not cut out for this kind of music?" Keisha pulled him closer to her on the bus seat. "Baby, when you play that piano, magic happens. I've seen grown people cry listening to you play. Your grandmother always said you had a gift, something special that can't be taught. Don't let one person's narrow mind convince you to give up on something you love. As their bus pulled up to their stop, Keisha made a decision. She was going to call Jaden's grandmother tonight and ask her to come visit. Dorothy Williams had stories to tell about her own experiences with prejudice in the music world, and maybe it was time for Jaden to hear them. More importantly, Dorothy had connections in the music community that might surprise a lot of people. It was time for Mrs. Catherine Henderson to learn that talent and musical heritage came in many different colors, and that her assumptions about proper musical breeding were about to be challenged in ways she never expected. The fight for Jaden's musical future was just beginning. That evening, Dorothy Williams received the phone call that would change everything. At 78 years old, she thought her days of fighting musical prejudice were behind her. But hearing her daughter-in-law's trembling voice as she described what had happened to Jaden brought back memories she tried to bury for decades. "Tell me exactly what this teacher said," Dorothy requested, her voice steady but with an edge that Keisha had never heard before. As Keisha recounted Mrs. Henderson's words about breeding, cultural understanding, and proper training, Dorothy's grip tightened on the phone. She'd heard those same coded phrases in 1962 when she'd auditioned for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. She'd heard them again in 1975 when she'd applied to teach at the prestigious Hartwell Music Academy. The language had evolved slightly, but the meaning remained the same. "Grandma Dorothy, I don't know what to do," Keisha said. "Jaden's so talented, but this woman made him feel like he doesn't belong. I'm afraid he's going to give up music altogether." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decision. "Keisha, honey, I think it's time I paid a visit to Lincoln Elementary. There are some things about my past that I haven't shared with Jaden yet. Things that Mrs. Catherine Henderson needs to know." "What do you mean?" Keisha asked. "I mean," Dorothy said slowly, "that Mrs. Henderson is about to learn that she doesn't know nearly as much about musical breeding and proper training as she thinks she does." The next morning, Principal Thompson arrived at school to find a message waiting on his desk. Dorothy Williams had requested a meeting to discuss her grandson's experience with the music program. Something about the formal tone of the request and the way his secretary had emphasized Mrs. Williams' polite but insistent manner told him this was more serious than a typical grandparent complaint. Meanwhile, in the music room, Mrs. Henderson was preparing for another day of auditions, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. She'd convinced herself that her handling of Jaden Williams had been professional and appropriate. The child simply wasn't ready for serious classical music, and it was her job to maintain standards. Emma Thompson and Tyler Davis were among the first to arrive for school, and they immediately sought out Ms. Rodriguez. Both children had been troubled by what they'd witnessed the day before. "Ms. Rodriguez," Emma said quietly, "what Mrs. Henderson said to Jaden yesterday, that wasn't right, was it?" Ms. Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "What do you think, Emma? How did Jaden's playing sound to you?" "It was beautiful," Tyler said immediately. "Way better than anything I can do, and I've been taking lessons for 2 years." "He knew the name of the piece and everything," Emma added. "He played it perfectly. I don't understand why Mrs. Henderson said he wasn't ready." Ms. Rodriguez felt proud of her students for recognizing the injustice they'd witnessed. "Sometimes adults make mistakes too," she said gently. "The important thing is that you both recognized talent when you heard it." At 10 a.m., Dorothy Williams walked into Lincoln Elementary School. She moved with the grace and dignity of someone who had spent decades commanding attention in concert halls, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing an elegant navy blue dress and carrying a leather portfolio that had seen decades of use. The office staff immediately noticed something different about this grandparent. There was an air of quiet authority about her, a presence that suggested someone accustomed to being taken seriously. When she introduced herself to the secretary, her voice carried the trained projection of a performer who had filled concert halls without microphones. "Good morning," she said with a warm but purposeful smile. "I'm Dorothy Williams. I believe Principal Thompson is expecting me." Principal Thompson emerged from his office within minutes, and Dorothy could see the curiosity in his eyes as he took in her appearance. Whatever he'd been expecting from the grandmother of a struggling student, it wasn't this poised, clearly educated woman who carried herself like aristocracy. "Mrs. Williams," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming in. Please, let's talk in my office." As they settled into chairs across from each other, Dorothy opened her portfolio and pulled out a folder of documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings that made Principal Thompson's eyes widen. "Mr. Thompson," Dorothy began, her voice calm but carrying undertones of steel, "I understand that my grandson Jaden had a difficult experience with your music teacher yesterday. Before we discuss that, I think there are some things about his musical heritage that you should know." She handed him a black and white photograph of a young black woman in an elegant gown, seated at a grand piano in what was clearly a prestigious concert hall. The program visible in the corner of the photo read Carnegie Hall, 1968. "That's me," Dorothy said simply. "Dorothy Mae Washington, as I was known professionally. I was the first African-American woman to graduate from the Juilliard School with a master's degree in piano performance. I performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and yes, Carnegie Hall." Principal Thompson stared at the photograph, then at the woman sitting across from him. The resemblance was unmistakable, but more than that, the bearing, the way she held herself, the unconscious authority in her posture, it all made perfect sense now. "Mrs. Williams," he said slowly, "I had no idea. This is extraordinary." "There's more," Dorothy continued, pulling out additional documents. "Concert reviews from the New York Times, programs from European tours, photographs with famous conductors and composers. I taught at the Berklee College of Music for 15 years before I retired. I've judged international piano competitions. I've trained students who now perform with major orchestras around the world." She paused, letting the weight of her credentials sink in. "And for the past 4 years, I've been teaching my grandson Jaden everything I know about classical music. His technique, his musical understanding, his ability to interpret complex pieces, all of that comes from the same tradition and training that your music teacher claims he lacks." Principal Thompson felt his stomach drop as he began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "Mrs. Williams, what exactly did Mrs. Henderson say to Jaden?" Dorothy's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain and anger beneath. "She told my grandson that classical music requires breeding, that people like him don't have the cultural background for serious music. She dismissed his performance of Chopin's Minute Waltz, a piece I taught him, using the same techniques I learned at Juilliard, as street corner playing." The principal rubbed his temples, already anticipating the storm that was about to engulf his school. "Mrs. Williams, I am so deeply sorry. This is completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that we will address this immediately." "Mr. Thompson," Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger, "I didn't come here for apologies. I came here because no child should ever be told that their race or background disqualifies them from pursuing their passion. I came here because Mrs. Henderson needs to understand that her prejudices are not just hurtful, they're also incredibly ignorant." Before Principal Thompson could respond, his secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are several parents here who are requesting to speak with you about the music program. They seem quite upset." Dorothy and Principal Thompson exchanged glances. "It seems," Dorothy said with a slight smile, "that word is beginning to spread about yesterday's incident." In the main office, Emma Thompson's mother, Sarah Thompson, was speaking in hushed but urgent tones with Tyler Davis's father, Robert Davis. Both parents had heard their children's accounts of what had happened in the music room, and both were deeply troubled. "I've never heard Emma so upset," Sarah was saying. "She keeps asking me why Mrs. Henderson was so mean to Jaden when he played so beautifully." "Tyler said the same thing," Robert replied. "He said Jaden's playing was incredible, better than kids twice his age. But Mrs. Henderson dismissed him like he was nothing." Other parents had begun to arrive as word spread through the school community. Ms. Rodriguez had discreetly mentioned the incident to a few trusted colleagues, and the story was beginning to take on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson was having what she thought was a normal morning, completely unaware of the storm gathering around her. She was reviewing sheet music for the advanced students when her classroom door opened and Principal Thompson entered, followed by Dorothy Williams. Mrs. Henderson looked up with mild irritation at the interruption, then did a double take at the elegant older woman accompanying the principal. Something about Dorothy's bearing immediately commanded attention and respect. "Mrs. Henderson," Principal Thompson said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'd like you to meet Dorothy Williams, Jaden's grandmother." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted to polite but condescending interest. She'd dealt with difficult parents before, and she assumed this was another case of a family member who couldn't accept their child's limitations. "Of course," Mrs. Henderson said with false warmth. "Please, sit down. I hope Jaden wasn't too disappointed about yesterday. I tried to explain to him that classical music requires a very specific type of preparation." Dorothy remained standing, her presence somehow filling the room. When she spoke, her voice carried the trained projection and perfect diction of someone who had commanded attention in the world's greatest concert halls. "Mrs. Henderson," Dorothy said, "I understand you told my grandson that classical music requires proper breeding and cultural understanding. I'm curious, what exactly do you know about musical breeding?" Mrs. Henderson bristled slightly at the challenge in Dorothy's tone. "Well, I have a master's degree in music education from Northwestern University. I've been teaching for 25 years. I think I'm quite qualified to assess musical potential and background." "Northwestern," Dorothy mused. "A fine school. I guest lectured there several times during my tenure at Berkeley. Tell me, during your studies there, did you ever hear of Dorothy Mae Washington?" Something in the way Dorothy asked the question made Mrs. Henderson pause. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. "I'm not sure," Mrs. Henderson said slowly. "Should I know that name?" Dorothy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." She pulled out one of the concert programs from her portfolio and handed it to Mrs. Henderson. It was from a 1970 performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, featuring soloist Dorothy Mae Washington. Mrs. Henderson stared at the program, then at Dorothy, then back at the program. The photograph on the cover showed a young Dorothy in formal concert attire, and the biographical note described her as one of the most promising young classical pianists of her generation. "I don't understand," Mrs. Henderson said weakly. "Let me help you understand," Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger. "I am Dorothy Mae Washington. I graduated from Juilliard with highest honors in 1965. I was the first African-American woman to receive a master's degree in piano performance from that institution. I performed with major orchestras around the world, recorded several albums, and taught at Berklee College of Music for 15 years. She pulled out additional documents, reviews from the New York Times praising her extraordinary technical brilliance and musical sensitivity, photographs with renowned conductors, programs from European concert tours. "And for the past 4 years, Dorothy continued, I have been teaching my grandson Jaden using the same methods, the same musical understanding, the same cultural knowledge that I learned at Juilliard and refined through decades of professional performance." Mrs. Henderson's face had gone completely pale. She stared at the documents in her hands as if they might somehow be fake, but the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "When you told Jaden that he lacked proper breeding and cultural understanding," Dorothy said, her voice like ice, "you were not just insulting an 8-year-old child. You were dismissing 4 generations of musical excellence in my family. You were rejecting the very tradition and training that you claim to value." Principal Thompson watched as Mrs. Henderson seemed to shrink in her chair. The arrogance and certainty that had defined her interactions with Jaden had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization of how catastrophically wrong she had been. "Mrs. Williams," Mrs. Henderson whispered, I had no idea. I never meant to." "You never meant to what?" Dorothy interrupted. "You never meant to judge a child based on the color of his skin rather than his obvious talent? You never meant to assume that a black family couldn't possibly understand classical music? You never meant to perpetuate the same prejudices that nearly destroyed my own career 50 years ago? The door to the music room suddenly opened, and Jaden walked in with Ms. Rodriguez. They had been on their way to the library when Ms. Rodriguez suggested they stop by to pick up some sheet music Jaden had left behind. Jaden stopped short when he saw his grandmother standing in the middle of the room, facing Mrs. Henderson with an expression he'd never seen before. Dorothy looked like a queen holding court, powerful and dignified and absolutely in command of the situation. "Grandma?" Jaden said uncertainly. Dorothy's expression immediately softened as she turned to her grandson. "Hello, sweetheart. I came to have a conversation with Mrs. Henderson about music and talent and the importance of recognizing both when we see them." Mrs. Henderson looked at Jaden with new eyes, seeing not the child she had dismissed yesterday but the heir to a musical legacy that put her own credentials to shame. The boy standing in the doorway had been trained by a woman who had achieved everything Mrs. Henderson had ever dreamed of in the classical music world. "Jaden," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice barely above a whisper, would you mind playing that Chopin piece again? The one from yesterday?" Jaden looked confused and a little scared. Yesterday, Mrs. Henderson had stopped him mid-performance and humiliated him in front of his classmates. Now she was asking him to play again, but her whole demeanor had changed completely. "It's okay, sweetheart," Dorothy said gently. "Show them what we've been working on." Can you imagine the power of that moment? When generations of musical excellence come together to challenge prejudice and prove that talent has no color? If this story is moving you as much as it's moving me, show your support by hitting that subscribe button. We share stories like this because they need to be told. And I'm curious, drop a comment and tell me about a time when someone surprised you with their hidden talents. Sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come from the most unexpected places. But Jaden isn't done yet. What happens next will leave you speechless. Jaden approached the piano slowly, still uncertain about what was happening but trusting his grandmother's presence. He sat down at the bench and placed his hands on the keys, the same keys that had felt like home yesterday before Mrs. Henderson's words had made him question everything. But something was different this time. With his grandmother standing behind him, with the weight of her legacy and love supporting him, Jaden felt a confidence he'd never experienced before. When he began to play, it wasn't just Chopin's Minute Waltz that flowed from his fingers, it was 4 generations of musical passion, struggle, triumph, and artistry. The performance was transcendent. Every note was perfectly placed, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical understanding that couldn't be taught in conservatories because it came from something deeper, from love, from heritage, from the accumulated wisdom of a grandmother who had fought the same battles and emerged victorious. Mrs. Henderson sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face as she listened. This wasn't just good playing, this was the kind of musical communication that she'd spent her entire career hoping to inspire in her students. The technical precision was flawless, but more than that, the emotional depth and artistic maturity were extraordinary. When the final notes faded away, the room remained silent for several heartbeats. Then Principal Thompson began to applaud, followed by Ms. Rodriguez, and finally, hesitantly, by Mrs. Henderson herself. That was. Mrs. Henderson started, then stopped, unable to find words adequate to what she'd just heard. "That was my grandson," Dorothy said simply. "The same grandson you told yesterday that he didn't have the cultural background for classical music. The same child you dismissed because you assumed his family couldn't possibly understand musical excellence." Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. She walked over to where Jaden still sat at the piano, looking up at her with those same innocent eyes that had trusted her yesterday before she'd crushed his dreams. "Jaden," she said, her voice breaking, "I owe you the deepest apology any teacher has ever owed a student. I was wrong, not just about your music, but about everything. I let my prejudices blind me to your extraordinary gift, and I am so sorry." She turned to Dorothy, her face streaked with tears. "Mrs. Williams, I know who you are now. I studied your recordings in college, your interpretation of the Chopin ballades, your performance of the Rachmaninoff concertos. I never connected. I'm so deeply ashamed of what I said to your grandson." Mrs. Henderson, Dorothy said, her voice stern but not unkind, your apology is a start, but words alone aren't enough. The damage you did to Jaden yesterday goes deeper than musical criticism. You attacked his sense of belonging, his cultural identity, his very right to pursue his passion. I know, Mrs. Henderson whispered. I know, and I don't know how to fix it. You fix it, Dorothy said firmly, by examining your own biases and making sure this never happens to another child. You fix it by recognizing that musical talent and cultural understanding come in many different colors and backgrounds. You fix it by becoming the teacher that every child deserves, not just the ones who look like you. Over the next hour, word of what was happening in the music room spread throughout Lincoln Elementary. Parents, teachers, and administrators gathered as Dorothy shared more of her story and more of the evidence of her extraordinary career. The impact was immediate and profound. Parents who had always felt that their children were judged differently in the music program suddenly understood why. Teachers who had witnessed Mrs. Henderson's subtle biases over the years finally had a framework for what they'd been seeing. But the most important change was in Jaden himself. As he listened to his grandmother share stories of her career, of the prejudice she'd faced and overcome, of the legacy she was passing down to him, something fundamental shifted in how he saw himself and his place in the world of music. Grandma, he said during a quiet moment, why didn't you ever tell me about all of this before? Dorothy knelt down so she was at eye level with her grandson. Because, sweetheart, I wanted you to love music for itself, not because of what I had achieved. I wanted your passion to be pure, to come from your own heart. But now I see that you also need to know where you come from, what battles have been fought before you, and how strong your musical family really is. The talent show auditions were rescheduled, and this time they were conducted by a panel that included Dorothy Williams as a guest judge. When Jaden performed his Chopin waltz for the official audition, the response was overwhelmingly positive. But more importantly, Mrs. Henderson had begun a process of genuine self-examination and change. She enrolled in diversity training, began studying the contributions of African American musicians to classical music, and slowly started to rebuild her understanding of what musical excellence could look like. 3 months later, Jaden Williams performed at Lincoln Elementary's talent show to a standing ovation. In the audience, Mrs. Henderson applauded with tears in her eyes, finally understanding that she was witnessing not just talent, but the continuation of a musical legacy that was every bit as valid and valuable as any European tradition. Dorothy Williams sat in the front row, her heart full as she watched her grandson share his gift with the world. The fight wasn't over, prejudice and bias would always exist, and Jaden would face other challenges as he grew up. But he now knew who he was, where he came from, and that his place in the world of classical music was not just legitimate but essential. After the performance, Mrs. Henderson approached Jaden and his family. Jaden, she said, I hope you'll consider continuing to work with me this year. I have a lot to learn about being a better teacher, and I think you could help me understand how to nurture talent in all my students, regardless of their background. Jaden looked up at his grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. I'd like that, Mrs. Henderson, he said. But only if you promise to listen to all your students with open ears and an open heart. I promise, Mrs. Henderson said, and for the first time since the incident began, her smile was genuine and filled with hope. 6 months later, Lincoln Elementary's music program had been transformed. Students from all backgrounds were encouraged to explore classical music, and Mrs. Henderson had become an advocate for diversity and inclusion in music education. She never forgot the lesson that 8-year-old Jaden Williams and his remarkable grandmother had taught her, that prejudice doesn't just hurt the people it targets, it blinds us to the beauty and talent that surrounds us every day. The racist teacher who had once mocked a black boy at the piano had learned to see beyond color to the music that lives in every human heart. And Jaden Williams continued to play, his music carrying forward the legacy of his grandmother and the promise of a more inclusive future for classical music. Sometimes it takes a moment of perfect music to shatter years of imperfect thinking. Sometimes it takes a child to teach an adult what really matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, even the hardest hearts can learn to change. This story reminds us that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. Every child deserves to have their talents recognized and celebrated, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. If Jaden's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. We believe in sharing stories that matter, stories that change perspectives, and stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And here's my final question for you. How can we each do better at seeing the potential in everyone around us? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of music, prejudice, and redemption. Until next time, keep believing in the power of second chances and the magic that happens when we truly listen to each other.